The town of Ashbourne wasn't on any map. It was said to be nestled deep in a forgotten valley, where the fog never lifted and time refused to move forward. Stories whispered about the town's uncanny allure. Those who stumbled upon it rarely left, and those who did spoke of strange dreams and fragmented memories. I heard about Ashbourne from my uncle, a man consumed by his obsession with the arcane. His stories, once dismissed as the ramblings of a broken mind, took on a sinister weight when his journals arrived at my doorstep after his sudden death. They were a tangle of cryptic notes, warnings, and a hand-drawn map. The map bore a single mark, Ashbourne, with the words, "Enter if you dare, but beware the fog." Curiosity overrode caution, and soon I found myself planning a journey to Ashbourne. I wasn't going alone. 3 friends joined me, each compelled by their own motivations. Sarah, ever the skeptic, viewed it as a puzzle to solve. Mike, whose boundless curiosity often got the better of him, treated it like an adventure. And Emma, quiet and intuitive, seemed drawn by something she couldn't explain. The journey felt like a descent into another world. The roads became narrower and darker, the air heavier. By the time we reached the valley, the fog had engulfed us, swallowing our car and turning the landscape into a blurred void. The laughter and chatter that had filled our drive evaporated as we entered Ashbourne. The oppressive silence of the town replaced it, wrapping around us like a shroud. The town square was the first thing we saw. The buildings leaned at impossible angles, their decaying facades covered in patches of moss. Shadows flickered unnaturally, and the cobblestones beneath our feet were slick with moisture. A single, crooked lamppost cast a dim, sickly light over the scene. "What the hell is this place?" Mike muttered, his usual humor replaced by unease. Sarah scanned the area, her sharp eyes picking out details the rest of us missed. "It's not just old, it's wrong," she said, pointing out the uneven proportions of the buildings and the way the mist seemed to pool unnaturally in certain areas. We agreed to split up and search for signs of life. Mike volunteered to check the eastern edge of town, where the mist was thickest. Sarah stayed behind, sketching the bizarre architecture. Emma and I headed toward the center of town, our steps echoing eerily on the empty streets. We made a pact to meet back in the square by sunset. When the time came, Mike didn't show. At first, we thought he'd lost track of time. He was always easily distracted, especially when something piqued his curiosity. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, concern began to gnaw at us. We retraced his steps, calling his name into the thickening fog. We found his phone near an old well at the edge of town. It lay face down in the dirt, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. The last photo he had taken sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just a picture of the well, it was of something inside it. A pair of glowing red eyes stared back at us, faint but unmistakable. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I shone my flashlight into the well, but the beam was swallowed by darkness. A faint sound rose from the depths, a rhythmic dripping, like water falling onto stone, but somehow wrong. Emma picked up the phone, her expression grim. "We need to leave. Now!" But as we turned back toward the square, a distant noise stopped us. Wet footsteps echoed faintly, growing louder. They didn't come from behind us or ahead. They seemed to come from all directions at once. The mist thickened, pressing in, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving within it. A shadow, tall and twisted, with crimson eyes that glimmered like dying embers. We ran. Back at the inn, the only habitable building we'd found, we locked ourselves in and tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Sarah paced the room, her sketches abandoned. Emma sat by the window, staring into the mist. I couldn't stop looking at the phone in my hand, its screen frozen on the image of those eyes. That night, I dreamed of the well. I stood at its edge, staring down into the black abyss. A voice whispered my name, soft at first but growing louder until it was a deafening roar. Something moved in the darkness, a shape shifting and writhing, too alien to comprehend. I woke with a start, gasping for air. In the dim light of dawn, we resolved to search for Mike again. But before we could leave, Emma froze, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she asked. We listened. At first, there was nothing but the groaning of the old building. Then, faintly, came the sound of wet footsteps echoing down the hall. The mist clung to us like damp wool as we stepped out of the inn. The air was colder, heavier, and carried a faint, metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. The sunlight, if it could be called that, was pale and weak, barely piercing the shroud that enveloped the town. "We stay together this time," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Sarah nodded, her jaw tight, while Emma lingered near the doorway, her eyes darting nervously toward the square. We decided to retrace Mike's steps, hoping to find some clue he might have left behind. The well was the logical place to start, though none of us said aloud what we feared most, that he had gone down into its depths. When we reached the well, the air grew colder. The moisture on its stones seemed to glisten with an unnatural hue, and the faint symbols etched into the surface shimmered faintly as though alive. The footprints we had seen the night before were still there, leading away from the well and into the mist. "We didn't imagine them," Sarah murmured, crouching to examine the prints. "They were human, but elongated, the proportions wrong. These don't look like Mike's. Then whose are they?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. No one had an answer. The thought of following the trail made my stomach churn, but something deeper, a compulsion I couldn't explain, pushed me forward. We moved cautiously, our flashlights piercing the mist, which seemed to ripple and twist as if alive. The footprints led us to a decrepit house at the edge of town, its door hanging askew. Inside, the house smelled of rot and decay. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor, and the walls were adorned with more of the strange symbols we had seen on the well. They were crude yet intricate, etched with a purpose we couldn't begin to guess. "Why would Mike come here?" Sarah muttered, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "Maybe he didn't," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The air grew colder as we ventured deeper into the house. A staircase led downward, its steps creaking ominously under our weight. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows below. But when I turned, the space was empty. At the bottom of the stairs, we found a door ajar. The room beyond was filled with shelves lined with jars. Each jar contained something floating in a murky liquid, shapes that were indistinct yet unmistakably wrong. One jar glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. Sarah moved closer, her flashlight steady. "What are these?" Before I could answer, the faint sound of tapping filled the room, rhythmic and deliberate. It came from the far corner, where a figure stood motionless, its back to us. My heart seized as it began to turn, slowly, its movements unnatural. The face was hidden by a mask, carved with the same symbols that adorned the walls and the jars. We didn't wait to see more. We ran, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the empty house, chased by the tapping that seemed to grow louder behind us. The mist outside felt suffocating, clinging to us as we stumbled back to the square. At the inn, Emma was the first to speak. "It's not just the town. It's alive. All of it. Watching." Her words, as unsettling as they were, felt true. The mist seemed to press against the windows, and the faint hum we'd noticed before now resonated louder, like a heartbeat surrounding us. We barricaded ourselves in the main room, but sleep eluded us. The night stretched on endlessly, filled with the faint sound of footsteps outside, circling the building. Each time I thought they had stopped, they would start again, deliberate and mocking. Just before dawn, I woke to find Sarah standing by the window. She was staring out into the mist, her face pale. "I saw him," she said without turning. "Mike! He was out there." I joined her at the window, but the square was empty, save for the swirling mist. "You're imagining things," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. She turned to me then, her eyes hollow. "No, he's out there, and he's not alone." The morning brought no relief. The mist was thicker than ever, muffling all sound and making the town feel even more isolated. Emma was the first to voice what we all felt but refused to admit. We're not getting out of here, are we? I wanted to argue, to offer some shred of hope, but the truth sat heavy on my tongue. Instead, I focused on the map my uncle had drawn. His cryptic notes mentioned a core, a place that binds the town. If we could find it, maybe we could understand the forces holding us here, or escape them. We set out again, this time heading toward the church, the tallest structure in town. Its bell tower loomed over the square, a jagged silhouette against the pale light filtering through the mist. The wooden doors were warped and swollen, but they opened with an almost welcoming creak as we approached. Inside, the air was colder, carrying the scent of damp stone and decay. Dust motes swirled in the faint beams of light that filtered through the cracked stained glass windows. The pews were lined with tattered hymnals, their pages yellowed and curling. At the altar, we found more of the strange symbols carved into the stone like some twisted language. Emma's flashlight illuminated a brass key resting on the altar, its surface tarnished with age. "Do you think this is what he meant?" Sarah asked, picking up the key. It felt heavier than it should, its weight unnatural. Before I could answer, the church trembled. A deep, resonant sound echoed through the building, not unlike the toll of a bell, but distorted and wrong. The mist outside thickened, pressing against the stained glass until it seemed like the walls themselves might collapse. The tremor subsided, but the atmosphere in the church grew heavier. The mist poured through the cracks in the windows and doors, pooling around our feet. Emma pointed toward the back of the building, where a trapdoor lay partially hidden beneath a tattered rug. "We have to go down," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The descent was suffocating. The staircase spiraled downward, the walls slick with moisture. The deeper we went, the stronger the scent of decay became. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as though the darkness itself resisted it. At the bottom, we found a vast chamber lined with shelves of books, jars, and strange artifacts. The air hummed with an energy that set my teeth on edge. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it rested an orb, swirling with crimson and black mist. As we approached, the whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, overlapping until they were a deafening chorus. The orb seemed to pulse in time with the whispers, its glow intensifying. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "This is the core." The moment we stepped closer, the shadows in the room came alive. They twisted and writhed, coalescing into forms that were almost human but stretched and distorted. Their eyes glowed red, identical to the ones we'd seen in the photo from the well. One of them lunged at us, its movements unnatural and jerky. Sarah swung her flashlight at it, and for a moment, it recoiled, the light burning through its form like fire. But they didn't stop. More of them emerged from the shadows, their whispers turning into a low, guttural chant. "Destroy it," Emma shouted, pointing at the orb. I grabbed the brass key, its weight now feeling almost unbearable, and plunged it into the orb's surface. The room erupted in light, blinding and searing. The shadows screamed, their forms unraveling as the orb cracked, releasing a wave of heat and energy. The light faded, and the chamber fell silent. The orb was gone, reduced to a pile of ash. The whispers had stopped, and the oppressive hum in the air dissipated. But something felt wrong. As we ascended the stairs, the mist seemed lighter, less alive. The church above was still, the air no longer vibrating with energy. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. But when we stepped outside, the town was unchanged. The mist still clung to the streets, and the oppressive silence remained. "Did we do it?" Sarah asked, clutching the brass key tightly. Emma shook her head. "No, it's still here, watching." And then we heard it, a low, guttural voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You cannot destroy me," it said. "The fog is eternal." The voice reverberated in our heads, low and guttural, as though the town itself had spoken. "The fog is eternal." It repeated, each word heavy with menace. The mist around us seemed to surge, swallowing the streets and blotting out what little light remained. We ran back to the inn, our breaths ragged and our footsteps echoing hollowly on the cobblestones. Inside, we barricaded the door again, but this time it felt useless. The fog had already found its way in. It seeped through the cracks in the walls and windows, swirling around our ankles. Emma slumped into a chair, her face pale. "We didn't stop it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah paced the room, clutching the brass key. "There's something we're missing. That orb, it wasn't the end. It was just a piece of it." I sat by the window, staring out at the fog. It pressed against the glass, coiling and shifting like a living thing. My uncle's journals had hinted at the town's power, but none of his warnings had prepared me for this. "The core was just a vessel," I said finally. "The fog isn't in one place. It's everywhere." The first sign of the fog's retaliation came that night. The sound of footsteps returned, louder and more deliberate. They circled the inn, slow and heavy, as though something enormous was pacing just outside. The floorboards beneath us creaked, as if responding to the weight of an unseen force. Emma clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's inside," she whispered. At first, I didn't believe her, but then I saw it, an outline in the mist, barely perceptible, but undeniably there. It moved slowly, its shape twisting and contorting as though it struggled to hold a solid form. Its eyes glowed, faintly red, like embers dying in a fire. "Turn off the lights," Sarah hissed. "Now!" We killed the flashlights and lanterns, plunging the room into darkness. The shape in the mist hesitated, its movements slower, less certain. For a moment, I thought it might leave, but then the whispers began, soft and insidious, seeping into my mind like poison. "Come back to us," they said. "You belong here." The whispers didn't stop, even after dawn broke. They followed us as we ventured out of the inn, their voices curling around us like smoke. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the town itself resisted our movements. We made our way to the clock tower, the last major structure we hadn't explored. Its hands were frozen at midnight, and the rusted gears visible through the broken face seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. The interior was worse. The air was thick and stifling, the walls covered in the same symbols we'd seen in the well and the house. At the base of the tower, we found a staircase winding upward into darkness. The whispers grew louder as we climbed, their tone shifting from seductive to desperate. At the top, we found another room, smaller and less ornate than the one beneath the church. A crude altar stood at the center, its surface stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. Behind it, a large mirror hung on the wall, its surface warped and cloudy. Sarah approached the altar, her hands trembling as she placed the brass key on its surface. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, and the mirror began to ripple, its surface undulating like water. The figure appeared again, stepping out of the mist that now seeped through the walls. It was taller than before, its shape more defined but still wrong. Its eyes glowed brighter, and its voice filled the room. "You cannot escape," it said. "You are already part of me." The room shook, and the mirror shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. The fog surged toward us, alive with malevolent intent. I grabbed the key from the altar, its surface burning hot in my hand, and shouted for the others to run. We fled down the stairs, the fog chasing us with an almost animalistic fury. When we burst out into the square, the mist surrounded us, cutting off every exit. The streets twisted and shifted, the town reshaping itself into a maze. "We're trapped," Emma said, her voice cracking. "No," Sarah said, clutching the key. "It's trying to keep us from something." "What?" I demanded. What could possibly be worse than this? But before she could answer, the mist parted, revealing a path leading back to the church. The building loomed larger than before, its bell tolling faintly despite the broken mechanism. The sound filled the air, a distorted echo that made my skin crawl. "It's leading us back," Emma said. "It wants us to go there." The church towered over us as we approached, its silhouette warped by the mist. The bell continued to toll, the sound growing louder with each step. It wasn't just noise. It was a presence, heavy and oppressive, reverberating in my chest like a second heartbeat. The brass key in Sarah's hand seemed to vibrate, as though responding to the bell's call. She clutched it tightly, her knuckles white, but her steps didn't falter. Emma followed closely, her eyes darting nervously toward the shifting shadows in the mist. I brought up the rear, my flashlight flickering uselessly against the darkness. When we reached the church doors, they opened before we could touch them. The sound echoed through the empty interior, a low groan that set my teeth on edge. Inside, the air was colder, heavier, and carried a faint metallic tang. The interior of the church had changed. The pews were gone, replaced by rows of stone pillars that stretched upward into a void where the ceiling should have been. The stained glass windows were no longer cracked but whole, their colors shifting and pulsing with a light that seemed alive. At the center of the room, where the altar had once stood, was a circle of symbols carved into the stone floor. The brass key in Sarah's hand grew hotter as we approached, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "They're here," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Watching us." I followed her gaze and saw them. Figures standing just beyond the reach of the shifting light. They were barely human, their shapes distorted and incomplete, as if they had been half-formed from the fog itself. Their eyes glowed red, unblinking. The ground beneath us began to vibrate as Sarah stepped into the circle. The brass key glowed faintly, its light pulsing in time with the whispers. She hesitated, looking back at us. I think this is where it ends." Before I could respond, the bell tolled again, louder and more distorted than before. The vibrations intensified, and the figures began to move, stepping closer. Their forms twisted and stretched, their movements jerky and unnatural. The air grew thick, suffocating. "Do it!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the din. Sarah knelt in the center of the circle and plunged the key into the stone. The symbols lit up, their light blindingly bright. The figures recoiled, their forms disintegrating as the light spread outward, pushing the mist back. For a moment, everything was silent. The light dimmed, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. I thought it was over, but then the ground beneath the circle cracked, and a new sound emerged, a deep, guttural roar that shook the church. The mist surged inward, coiling around the circle like a living thing. From the cracks in the stone, something began to rise. It wasn't human. Its form was massive, shifting and writhing as though it couldn't settle on a single shape. Its eyes burned brighter than the others, their crimson light piercing the darkness. It spoke, its voice a deafening rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You cannot destroy me," it said. "I am the fog, I am the town, and you are mine." The light from the symbols flickered, struggling against the entity's presence. Emma screamed as the mist lashed out, wrapping around her ankles and pulling her toward the circle. I grabbed her arm, pulling her back, but the force was too strong. Sarah shouted something I couldn't hear, her voice lost in the cacophony. She raised the key again, its light flaring brighter than before. The entity recoiled, its form dissolving momentarily before solidifying again. It reached out with tendrils of mist, striking at all of us. "Keep it distracted," Sarah screamed, her voice breaking. She turned back to the circle, holding the key above her head. "I think I can end this." The next moments were chaos. The mist became a storm, swirling violently around the church. The figures we had seen earlier re-emerged, clawing their way toward us. The entity roared, its voice shaking the walls, but Sarah didn't falter. She slammed the key into the stone once more, and this time the light was blinding. The symbols flared to life, burning away the mist and the figures. The entity screamed, its form unraveling as the light consumed it. The bell tolled one final time, its sound splintering into silence. And then everything was still. We stumbled out of the church, the air around us clear and cold. The mist was gone, and the town lay silent. The oppressive weight that had hung over Ashbourne was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Sarah held the brass key in her hand, its glow now extinguished. She looked at me, her face pale and exhausted. "Is it over?" she asked. I didn't know, but as we walked back to the square, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The road out of Ashbourne felt longer than the one that had brought us in. The car's engine hummed softly as we drove through the now clear valley, the sky above an empty slate of gray. None of us spoke. The weight of what had happened, what we'd faced, clung to us like a second skin. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, clutching the brass key. Its glow had faded entirely, leaving behind a dull, lifeless metal. Emma stared out the window, her face pale and distant, as though part of her had never left the church. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind replayed the moment we'd destroyed the entity, the way it had screamed and unraveled into nothingness. For a moment, I dared to hope it was truly over. We reached the edge of the valley by dusk, and the weight in the air seemed to lift further as we passed the final curve in the road. The landscape opened up, revealing a vast expanse of fields and forests, untouched by the unnatural fog that had plagued Ashbourne. "I think we're free," Emma said quietly, her voice trembling. Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the key, her expression unreadable. I glanced at her, a question forming on my lips, but something stopped me. The silence between us felt fragile, like speaking might shatter it. That night, I lay awake in my bed, the events of the past few days replaying endlessly in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fog, the twisted figures, and the entity's burning eyes. Sleep came in fitful bursts, filled with fragmented dreams of the church and the key. Around midnight, I woke with a start, my heart racing. The room was dark, but the air felt wrong. Heavy, pressed against my chest like the fog had returned. I reached for the lamp on my bedside table, but my hand froze as I heard it, a whisper, soft and insidious. "You cannot escape." The words were faint, almost a breath against my ear. I turned on the light, flooding the room with warmth, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, overlapping, until it became a chorus of voices. I called Sarah the next morning, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. She didn't answer. I tried Emma next, then Mike. Each call went straight to voicemail. Panic gripped me as I threw on clothes and rushed out the door, heading first to Sarah's apartment. Her car was in the driveway, but her curtains were drawn. I knocked on the door until my knuckles ached, shouting her name, but there was no response. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. Inside, the air was cold, and the house was silent. I found her in the living room, slumped on the couch, the brass key clutched in her hand. Her eyes were open, but she didn't seem to see me. Her lips moved silently, whispering words I couldn't hear. "Sarah," I shook her, but she didn't respond. The whispers filled the room. The same scene played out at Emma's house. She sat on the floor of her bedroom, staring blankly at the wall. The doll from the inn rested in her lap, its cracked face twisted into an eerie grin. She, too, was whispering, her voice lost in the chorus that followed me wherever I went. I tried to take the doll from her, but her hands tightened around it, her head snapping toward me. For the briefest moment, her eyes met mine, and I saw something alien behind them. Not Emma, something else. "Leave," she said, her voice distorted and layered, like it wasn't hers alone. I stumbled out of the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I drove back to Ashbourne that night. The compulsion was too strong to ignore, the whispers too loud to drown out. The valley was the same as we'd left it, clear and quiet. But as I descended the road, the mist began to creep in again, tendrils coiling around the car like welcoming arms. The town was silent, its streets empty. The buildings seemed to lean closer, their warped facades more pronounced in the dim light. The church stood at the center, its doors wide open, as though expecting me. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating. The symbols on the floor glowed faintly, their light pulsing in time with my heartbeat. The brass key was still in my pocket, heavy and cold. I stepped into the circle, my footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The whispers stopped, You came back, the voice said, low and resonant, vibrating through the walls. The entity's form emerged from the shadows, its eyes burning brighter than before. You cannot destroy me. You never could. I gripped the key tightly, my hand trembling. What do you want? The entity laughed, a deep, guttural sound. You, all of you. The fog binds you to this place, as it always has. The circle's light flared as I raised the key, its heat burning into my palm. The entity recoiled, its form flickering and unstable. The whispers returned, louder and more desperate. This is where it ends, I said, plunging the key into the stone one final time. The light consumed everything, blinding and searing. The entity's scream filled the air, a sound of rage and pain. The mist swirled violently, then began to dissipate, drawn into the cracks in the floor. When the light faded, the church was empty. The mist was gone. The key lay in pieces on the floor, its power spent. I stumbled out into the square, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. The town was silent, its oppressive weight lifted. But as I reached the edge of the valley, I glanced in the rearview mirror. And there, standing in the center of the square, was the entity. Its crimson eyes burned brightly, watching as I disappeared into the horizon.